with a radical questioning of what the European intellectual tradition has long taken for granted as moral self-evidence. For Nietzsche, morality is not a system of timeless commandments handed down from a metaphysical beyond, but a historical constellation of forces, drives, interpretations, and psychological needs that has congealed, over centuries, into something that presents itself as self-evident, precisely because its origin has been forgotten. In this video, I will try to answer the question what the underlying anthropology of Nietzsche is and how it relates to Kant and Hegel. To speak of ethics is for Nietzsche first to ask about the origin of values, not their application or their internal coherence. Morality is not the voice of God, nor the voice of reason, but the sediment of struggles, injuries, desires, and creative acts, deposited layer upon layer, until what began as an active interpretation hardens into what looks like a fact. In this genealogical perspective lies the decisive methodological shift that separates Nietzsche from almost the entire prior tradition of moral philosophy. Ethics becomes an inquiry into the meaning and genesis of the value structures that shape human action, rather than an attempt to justify or systematize those structures from within. Where Kant asks what the moral law commands, and Mill asks what produces the greatest happiness, Nietzsche asks a prior and more unsettling question. Why do we experience certain things as commanded at all, and whose interest is served by that experience? This genealogical method is not merely historical curiosity, it is itself a moral instrument, a scalpel applied to the body of inherited valuation. Nietzsche shows that European morality, and especially Christian morality, emerges from a profound reversal of the ancient aristocratic value order that he associates with Homeric Greece and early Rome. The master morality, born of strength, confidence, and abundance, called good whatever expressed vitality, nobility, and self-affirmation, and called bad whatever was weak, common, or base. A distinction, Nietzsche insists, made from the position of the strong looking outward and downward, not from the weak looking upward in judgment. This aristocratic order was gradually displaced, in a slow and largely invisible revolution of values, by a slave morality arising from ressentiment, the accumulated unexpressed resentment of those who lack the power to act, and who therefore convert their powerlessness into a moral verdict against power itself. Slave morality elevates humility, meekness, patience, and self-denial to virtues, and condemns strength, self-affirmation, and creative power as pride, cruelty, or sin. This reversal is not merely historical, but deeply psychological. The weak create a morality that sanctifies their weakness as goodness and binds the strong through guilt, so that the very vitality that once defined nobility now appears suspect, even to those who possess it. Ethics, on this reading, becomes an instrument of power exercised by the powerless, the most refined and most effective form of power, precisely because it does not present itself as power at all, but as justice, compassion, or law. From this diagnosis follows Nietzsche's sustained critique of the machinery of traditional morality. He rejects the notion of a metaphysical free will that stands behind action as its uncaused cause, since it is precisely this fiction of a neutral subject, free to have acted otherwise, that makes guilt and punishment intelligible. Strip away the fiction, Nietzsche argues, and the entire architecture of moral blame collapses into a more honest description of forces and consequences. He denies that suffering is inherently negative or something to be eliminated at all costs. For Nietzsche, suffering is a necessary condition for growth, intensity, and self-overcoming, the discipline that gives a life its form, as resistance gives a sculpture its shape. Ascetic ideals that deny the body, that flee from the senses toward a purified spirituality, appear to him as symptoms of a deep and often unconscious hostility toward existence itself, a hostility that masquerades as piety. An ethic built on selflessness, pity, and moral duty is, in his eyes, not a sign of human perfection, but frequently a sign of decadence, of a life too exhausted or too frightened to affirm itself, and which therefore seeks a morality that will excuse or even sanctify that exhaustion. In place of this morality, Nietzsche sets the principle of the will to power, which ought not to be understood, despite its later political misappropriation, as brute domination over others. It is rather the inner dynamism of life itself, the striving for intensity, form, expansion, and the overcoming of what is merely given. It is the creative force that generates values, shapes worlds, and heightens existence rather than merely preserving it. Ethics, reconceived along these lines, becomes the capacity to shape oneself, to experiment with oneself, to become, in Nietzsche's own recurring image, the artist of one's own life, giving style to one's character as a sculptor gives form to resistant stone. The moral question on this view is no longer, what ought I to do? A question that presupposes an external law awaiting obedience, but what form shall I give to my being? A question that returns responsibility to the self as its own legislator and its own material. In this light, the Übermensch appears not as a biologically superior figure, still less as a racial or political ideal, but as the symbolic horizon of the human being who, after the death of God, that is, after the collapse of the metaphysical guarantees that once secured meaning and value, does not fall into nihilism, but discovers instead the terrifying and liberating possibility of creating new values from nothing but his own will. The Übermensch lives not from guilt or duty, but from abundance, strength, and creative freedom. He does not need to be told what is good, because he has the strength to determine it. The highest expression of this freedom is Nietzsche's thought of amor fati, the love of one's fate, radicalized further still in the doctrine of eternal recurrence, the thought experiment of asking whether one could will every moment of one's life, down to its smallest suffering, to return eternally, without alteration, world without end. Life on this view is not merely to be endured, but embraced in its beauty and its severity, its chance and its necessity alike. To affirm life fully is to affirm its tragedy, not to explain the tragedy away, as theodicy attempts to do, exactly as it is, without remainder. Placed alongside the religious traditions of Judaism and Christianity, Nietzsche's ethics reveals a deep and instructive tension between metaphysical grounding and radical value creation. Nietzsche confronts both traditions as a genealogist who traces the descent of morality and interrogates its transcendent foundations rather than accepting them as given. Yet his relation to the two religions is markedly asymmetrical, and this asymmetry is one of the more delicate and frequently misread aspects of his thought. Christianity, for Nietzsche, represents the culmination and the most successful institutionalization of slave morality, a moral system that sanctifies weakness, elevates suffering as redemptive, and binds even the strong through an internalized guilt he calls, in the second essay of the genealogy, the bad conscience. The figure of Christ, who blesses the poor in spirit and sanctifies suffering as the path to grace, becomes for Nietzsche the symbol, though not notably the sole culprit, since he distinguishes sharply between Christ himself and the Pauline institution built upon him, of a moral inversion that tames life rather than intensifying it, that teaches the sufferer to find in his suffering a claim upon eternity rather than a spur to self-overcoming. Judaism occupies a more complex and more admired place in Nietzsche's thought, one that resists easy summary and that he himself treats with a striking ambivalence across his writings. Although he traces to ancient Israel, in the first essay of the genealogy, the historical origin of the very reversal of values he otherwise diagnoses, the priestly caste's transvaluation that made poverty, suffering, and powerlessness holy. He also expresses, particularly in Beyond Good and Evil, and in his later notebooks, a genuine admiration for the vitality, endurance, discipline, and intellectual seriousness of the Jewish people across the centuries of exile and persecution. Jewish ethics, grounded in halakha, in concrete law and embodied action, differs markedly from Christianity's emphasis on inward faith, otherworldly redemption, and the devaluation of the present life in favor of a promised beyond. It is not primarily ascetic in Nietzsche's pejorative sense, but practical and this-worldly, oriented not toward metaphysical salvation from the body, but toward the sanctification of concrete life within a covenantal and communal order. What Nietzsche, in his more generous moments, could recognize as a form of strength maintained under the most adverse historical conditions, rather than a morality generated by weakness alone. Judaism, unlike the Christianity Nietzsche knew and opposed, is for him not simply a religion of ressentiment, but a religion that had managed, against extraordinary odds, to preserve a certain hardness, a certain capacity for law and discipline, that he found largely absent in the softened, sentimentalized Christianity of his own 19th century Germany. This is not to say Nietzsche's admiration is uncomplicated, or that it amounts to an endorsement of Jewish theology as such. His respect is for a certain vital and disciplined comportment toward existence that he believed Judaism, uniquely among the monotheisms, had managed to sustain, even as he continued to locate, in its priestly origins, the historical seedbed of the very moral inversion he opposed. The deepest difference between Nietzsche and both religious traditions lies in the end, in the ontological status of values themselves. For Judaism and Christianity, values are divinely given, revealed at Sinai or in the Incarnation, and transmitted through tradition, text, and community across generations. The human task is fundamentally one of reception, interpretation, and faithful transmission. For Nietzsche, values are human creations without remainder, expressions of forces, drives, and historical struggles that have no anchor outside the human beings who generate them. Religious ethics interprets life in light of a meaning already given. Nietzschean ethics seeks to intensify life without appeal to any meaning beyond what the self can create and will. Where religion binds the human being to a transcendent order that precedes and exceeds him, Nietzsche calls the human being to bind himself instead to his own creative power, a vertiginous freedom that religious thought would regard not as liberation, but as the deepest form of idolatry, the elevation of the self to the place properly occupied by the transcendent. This contrast becomes even sharper and more philosophically precise when Nietzsche is placed beside Kant, whose shadow he never entirely escapes, even in opposing it. Kant grounds morality in the categorical imperative, a universal law of practical reason that binds independently of inclination, culture, temperament, or historical accident. Morality for Kant is autonomous in the strict sense, self-legislated by reason, but it is not creative in Nietzsche's sense. It is the recognition of an objective duty structure that every rational being, simply in virtue of being rational, must acknowledge, and could in principle derive for himself. Nietzsche rejects this universality root and branch. For him, Kantian ethics, for all its apparent rigor and its rhetoric of autonomy, is a refined and philosophically sophisticated form of asceticism, a moralization of self-denial that binds the human being to abstract, bloodless norms and suppresses precisely the creative, particular, embodied force that Nietzsche wants to liberate. The categorical imperative's demand for universalizability strikes Nietzsche as a demand for mediocrity dressed in the language of reason. What can be willed by everyone, he suggests, is likely to be worth little in particular. Reason itself, for Nietzsche, is not the disinterested source of morality Kant takes it to be, but a tool and a symptom shaped by deeper physiological and psychological forces, the will to power operating even in the philosopher's study, disguised as pure rational deliberation. Kant disciplines the human being through the majesty of an inner law. Nietzsche seeks to liberate him from the very notion that discipline of this kind is the highest human calling. The comparison with Hegel is subtler still, and arguably more consequential for understanding Nietzsche's place within German philosophy, since Hegel, unlike Kant, already historicizes ethical life, and so appears at first to anticipate Nietzsche's own genealogical instinct. Hegel, like Nietzsche, sees morality and spirit as thoroughly historical, unfolding through concrete forms of life, family, civil society, the state, rather than descending ready-made from an ahistorical reason. But for Hegel, history is nonetheless the progressive revelation and self-realization of reason, a dialectical process in which conflict and negation are always aufgehoben, taken up and preserved at a higher level, culminating in the ethical life cyclicate of the rational state and the full self-transparency of absolute spirit. Values arise historically, yes, but for Hegel they move, however painfully and through however much conflict, toward reconciliation, mutual recognition, and rational unity. Nietzsche recognizes no such teleology, and regards the very notion of a reconciling movement of Geist as one more disguised form of the ascetic ideal, a metaphysical comfort offered to a world that Nietzsche insists has no such comfort to give. Is not the unfolding of reason toward reconciliation, but a ceaseless succession of interpretations, conflicts, and revaluations, each imposing itself upon the last, without any guarantee of final synthesis. Where Hegel seeks reconciliation, Nietzsche seeks overcoming, which is not reconciliation, but supersession without return. Where Hegel sees at the end of the dialectic the absolute coming to know itself, Nietzsche sees only the open and unfinished possibility of the Übermensch, a figure who is emphatically not a culmination in Hegel's sense, since he has no fixed content and cannot be the last word of any dialectic. Every self-overcoming immediately opens onto the next. Hegel wants in the end to understand the world as rational through and through. Nietzsche wants to transform it, and suspects that the very desire to understand it as rational is already a symptom of the ascetic ideal's need for a world that makes sense. In the end, Judaism and Christianity bind the human being to a transcendent order that precedes and judges him. Kant binds him to the universal law of his own reason. Hegel binds him to the unfolding history of spirit, in which his particular life finds its meaning only as a moment within a larger rational whole. Nietzsche alone binds the human being to himself, to his creative power, his capacity for self-overcoming, his affirmation of life in its tragic fullness, without recourse to any of these external or higher courts of appeal. He does not simply oppose the prior tradition from outside it. He forces that tradition to reflect on its own genealogical foundations, to ask of itself the question it had never thought to ask of its own certainties. And in doing so he forces the modern human being, who stands after the death of God without quite having absorbed what that death entails, to ask whether he merely inherits his values, or whether he is capable of creating them anew, whether he submits to an order given in advance, or brings forth, at whatever cost and whatever risk, a new order of his own. In this open and unresolved question, a question Nietzsche poses more sharply than he ever definitively answers, lies the explosive force of his ethics, and the reason it continues to unsettle every tradition, religious or philosophical, that would ground the good in something other than the self that must, in the end, decide to live by it.
Das Wahre ist